The stars stretched endlessly before Admiral Jake Morrison as he stood on the bridge of the UHS Defiant, watching the blue glow of hyperspace fade into the familiar darkness of normal space. The year was 2387, and humanity had come so far from those early days when they could barely reach their own moon. Now they ruled 847 star systems, each one a testament to human determination and ingenuity. Jake adjusted his uniform and walked to the command chair, his boots making soft sounds on the polished deck. Around him, his crew worked with the quiet efficiency that had made the Defiant one of the most respected ships in the human colonial authority fleet. Navigation Officer Lisa Kane checked their position against the star charts, her fingers dancing across the holographic display. Security Chief Ryan Brooks monitored the sensor readings, always alert for any signs of trouble in the vast emptiness of space. Chief Engineer Amy Clark reported from the engine room that all systems were running perfectly, her voice carrying the pride she felt in maintaining the ship's advanced drives. The bridge hummed with activity, but it was the calm, purposeful activity of a crew that had worked together for years. They trusted each other completely, and more importantly, they trusted the system that had brought humanity to greatness. That system was built on one simple rule, one law that every human in the galaxy knew by heart: no human shall knowingly harm another human being, regardless of origin, belief, or allegiance. It seemed like such a simple thing, but Jake knew it was the foundation of everything they had built. The rule had been written in blood after the Proxima Wars, when human colonies had turned on each other in a brutal conflict that had lasted 15 years. Millions had died, and humanity had nearly destroyed itself before reaching the stars. The survivors had sworn it would never happen again, and they had kept that promise for 200 years. Lisa turned from her station, her dark hair catching the light from the displays. "Admiral, we're approaching the Kepler 442 system. Estimated arrival in 30 minutes. Her voice carried a note of concern that made Jake look up from his reports. "Any word from the colony?" he asked, though he already knew the answer. They had been trying to contact New Horizon Colony for 3 days, ever since the regular communication schedule had been broken. "Nothing, sir," Ryan reported from his position at the security station. "The last transmission was 4 days ago, routine. Status report, everything seemed normal." Jake nodded, but he felt a cold knot forming in his stomach. In his 25 years of service, he had learned to trust his instincts, and right now they were telling him that something was very wrong. The Kepler 442 system was home to 50,000 human colonists, families who had left Earth and the inner worlds to build new lives on the frontier. They would not simply stop communicating without a good reason. "Amy, how are our systems?" he asked into his comm unit. "All green, Admiral," came the reply from the engine room. "We're ready for anything." Jake hoped they would not need to be. The Defiant was equipped with the most advanced technology in human space, but it was designed for exploration and peacekeeping, not warfare. The weapon systems were primarily defensive, meant to protect the ship and its crew from pirates or natural hazards. The idea of fighting a real war was something that existed only in history books and the nightmares of old veterans. As they dropped out of hyperspace at the edge of the Kepler 442 system, the main screen filled with the familiar sight of a yellow star surrounded by its family of planets. The fourth planet, Kepler 442b, was a beautiful world of blue oceans and green continents, perfect for human colonization. It should have been bustling with activity, ships moving between the orbital stations and the surface communication channels. Filled with the ordinary chatter of a thriving colony, instead there was only silence. "Full sensor sweep," Jake ordered, and Ryan's fingers flew over his controls. The results appeared on the main screen moments later, and Jake felt his blood run cold. Where the colony ship New Horizon should have been in orbit around the planet, there was nothing. The massive vessel, home to 50,000 souls, had simply vanished. "Sir," Lisa said, her voice tight with worry, "I'm picking up debris at the edge of the system. The composition matches human ship construction." Jake closed his eyes for a moment, feeling the weight of command settle on his shoulders like a lead blanket. Somewhere out there, 50,000 humans were missing, possibly dead, and it was his job to find out what had happened to them. More than that, it was his duty to uphold the law that had kept humanity strong for 2 centuries. The rule was not just a law, it was a promise. It was the reason that alien species throughout the galaxy respected humanity, even though humans were neither the strongest nor the most technologically advanced race. The crystalline Arcturians, who could manipulate matter at the molecular level, looked to humanity for moral guidance. The aquatic cetaceans, whose ships could cross the galaxy in days, trusted human mediators to resolve their disputes. The proud Zephyrians, master warriors who had conquered hundreds of worlds, accepted human leadership in the Galactic Council because they knew that humans would never use their position to harm others. Ambassador Peter Hayes had spent his entire career building those relationships, working tirelessly to create a galaxy where different species could coexist in peace. Dr. Karen Wright led joint research projects that had advanced science by centuries, sharing knowledge freely with alien partners because she knew that cooperation was stronger than competition. Their work, and the work of thousands like them, was built on the foundation of that one simple rule. "Admiral," Ryan said, his voice cutting through Jake's thoughts, "I'm detecting an energy signature moving toward us." "It's not human." Jake opened his eyes and looked at the tactical display. A sleek ship was approaching from the direction of the inner system, its hull gleaming with the distinctive red and black markings of the Vorthan Empire. The Vorthans were a militant species that had never accepted human leadership in galactic affairs, viewing humanity's peaceful nature as weakness rather than strength. "Hail them," Jake ordered, though he suspected what the response would be. The main screen flickered, and the harsh features of a Vorthan commander appeared. His face was angular and predatory, with the distinctive ridge of bone that ran from his forehead to the back of his skull. When he spoke, his voice carried the guttural accent of his people. "Human vessel, you are trespassing in Vorthan space. Leave immediately or face the consequences." Jake kept his voice steady, though his heart was racing. "Commander, this is Admiral Morrison of the Human Colonial Authority. The Kepler 442 system is under human jurisdiction. We're here to investigate the disappearance of our colony ship." The Vorthan's laugh was like breaking glass. "Your colony ship is safe, human. For now. But your precious colonists will not remain so if you do not withdraw immediately." The transmission ended, leaving Jake staring at a blank screen. Around him, the bridge crew waited for orders, their faces reflecting the same mixture of fear and determination that he felt. They were 50,000 light-years from Earth, facing an enemy that had just admitted to taking human civilians hostage. The rule that had guided humanity for 2 centuries was about to face its greatest test. The holding cells aboard the Vorthan prison ship were cold and dark, filled with the smell of fear and desperation. Captain Danny Rodriguez pressed his face against the energy bars that kept him trapped, trying to see how many of his crew were still alive. The attack had come without warning 3 days ago, when the New Horizon was conducting routine orbital operations around Kepler 442. The Vorthan fleet had emerged from hyperspace like a pack of hunting wolves, their weapons already charged and ready to fire. Danny had tried to surrender immediately, knowing that the New Horizon was a colony ship with no real weapons to speak of. The massive vessel carried 50,000 civilians, including women and children who had left everything behind to build new lives on the frontier. They had families, dreams, and futures that stretched out before them like an endless road. Now, they were prisoners in the cold metal belly of an alien warship, their fate decided by creatures who saw mercy as weakness. Medical Officer Beth Turner sat in the corner of the cell, her uniform torn and stained with blood. She had been beaten during the initial capture, but her injuries were nothing compared to what the Vorthans had done to communications specialist Greg Miller. The young man lay unconscious on the metal floor, his face swollen beyond recognition. The aliens had wanted information about human defensive capabilities, and when Greg had refused to give it, they had made him an example for the others. "How many are left?" Danny asked quietly, his voice barely audible above the hum of the ship's engines. Beth looked up at him with eyes that had seen too much suffering. I count maybe 300 of the crew in the cells around us. The rest. She did not need to finish the sentence. The rest were dead, killed during the capture or executed afterward when they proved to be of no use to their captors. The sound of heavy footsteps echoed through the corridor, and Danny felt his stomach clench with dread. He knew that sound by now, the distinctive rhythm of Vorthan boots on metal deck plating. 2 guards appeared outside their cell, their weapons ready and their faces twisted with cruel anticipation. Behind them walked a figure that Danny had learned to fear more than death itself. Commander Vextar was the Vorthan officer in charge of the prison ship, a creature whose cruelty seemed to have no limits. His ridge of bone was decorated with small metal spikes, a sign of his rank and his willingness to inflict pain on others. When he spoke, his voice carried the authority of someone who had never learned to show mercy. "Human captain," he said, his words dripping with contempt. "You will come with us now. It is time for your people to see what happens to those who refuse to cooperate." Danny stood slowly, his legs shaking with exhaustion and fear. He had been through this before, dragged to the ship's communication center where the Vorthans broadcast their demands across human space. Each time, they had asked him to beg for surrender, to tell his people that resistance was hopeless. Each time he had refused, knowing that his words would be heard by millions of humans who looked to their leaders for strength. The communication center was a stark room filled with alien technology that hummed with malevolent energy. Banks of screens showed star charts and tactical displays, while banks of recording equipment waited to capture every word and image. Danny was forced into a chair in the center of the room, restraints snapping around his wrists and ankles with mechanical precision. "Today we will try something different," Vextar announced, his voice filled with anticipation. "Today we will show your people the price of defiance." The screens around the room flickered to life, showing images that made Danny's blood run cold. The main cargo bay of the New Horizon had been converted into a holding area for the civilian colonists. Thousands of men, women, and children were pressed together like cattle, their faces reflecting the same terror that Danny felt in his own heart. Among them, he could see families he had known for years, people who had trusted him to keep them safe during the long journey to their new home. "You see, human captain," Vextar continued, his voice like broken glass, "your precious colonists are quite comfortable for now, but their comfort depends entirely on your cooperation." Danny tried to speak, but his voice came out as a croak. "What do you want?" "What we have always wanted," the Vorthan replied. "The surrender of the Rigel, Proxima, and Vega systems to Vorthan control. Your people have held these strategic positions for too long, using them to project their false peace. Across the galaxy we will have them one way or another." The screen shifted to show another scene, this one from the bridge of the New Horizon. Danny recognized the location immediately, though it had been transformed into something from a nightmare. Vorthan technicians worked at the ship's communication array, preparing to broadcast their demands to human space. In the center of the room, a group of human prisoners knelt on the deck, their hands bound behind their backs. Danny's heart stopped as he recognized the faces. There was Lieutenant Sarah Kim, who had served with him for 8 years. Beside her knelt Engineer Marcus Webb, whose wife and children were somewhere in the cargo bay below. The youngest was communications trainee Lisa Park, barely out of the academy and full of dreams about exploring the stars. "No," Danny whispered, his voice breaking. "Please, not them." Vextar's laugh was like the sound of metal scraping against stone. "Oh yes, human captain, them and many more if your people do not surrender. We will broadcast their deaths across your empire, showing your citizens what happens when they trust in your weakness." The transmission began, and Danny watched in horror as the images were sent across the galaxy. On Earth, President Helen Stone would be seeing this. On the frontier worlds, families would be gathering around their screens, watching as their fellow humans faced death at the hands of alien monsters. The Galactic Council would be debating humanity's response. while alien ambassadors whispered about the failure of human leadership. Your people pride themselves on their rule, Vextar continued, his voice now being broadcast along with the images. No human shall harm another human, they say. But they say nothing about what happens when others harm humans. They have made themselves weak, and weakness invites destruction. Danny closed his eyes, trying to block out the sounds of fear and desperation that filled the room. He thought about the rule that had guided humanity for 2 centuries. The promise that had lifted them from the ashes of the Proxima Wars. It had seemed so simple then, so pure in its clarity. No human would ever again raise a hand against another. Human, no matter what the provocation, but the rule had been written by humans, for humans. It had never anticipated this moment when alien enemies would use that very mercy against them. The Vorthans had studied humanity carefully, learning their strengths and weaknesses with the patience of predators. They knew that humans would not abandon their principles easily, but they also knew that every principle had its breaking point. The execution began without ceremony. Vextar gave a simple gesture, and the Vorthan guards raised their weapons. Danny screamed, his voice lost in the mechanical sounds of the ship, but there was nothing he could do. The energy beams struck their targets with clinical precision, and 3 good people died because they had served under a captain who refused to break. The transmission ended, leaving Danny alone with his grief and rage. Around him, the Vorthans prepared for the next broadcast, the next demonstration of human helplessness. They had 50,000 more hostages to work with, and all the time in the galaxy to break the spirit of the species that had dared to lead. Through peace instead of strength, somewhere in the darkness of space, Admiral Jake Morrison was receiving the transmission, watching as his fellow humans died for the crime of serving their people. The rule that had made humanity great was about to face its greatest test, and Danny Rodriguez feared that it would not survive. The emergency session of the Human Colonial Authority Council had been called within hours of the first broadcast, but President Helen Stone knew that no amount of discussion could erase the images burned into her mind. 3 days had passed since the executions, and the galaxy was watching to see how humanity would respond to the most direct challenge to their core principle in 2 centuries. The council chamber on Earth was filled with the most powerful people in human space, their faces reflecting the same mixture of grief and rage that Helen felt in her own heart. Defense Secretary Kevin Walsh sat at the far end of the table, his jaw clenched with barely controlled anger. Chief of Staff Tony Adams shuffled through reports that detailed the public outcry across the colonies. General Frank Cooper stood near the main display, his uniform crisp despite the sleepless nights he had endured since the crisis began. The situation is deteriorating rapidly, Kevin began, his voice cutting through the tense silence. We have confirmed reports of riots on 17 colony worlds. The people are demanding action, and frankly I cannot blame them. We have the most advanced military in the galaxy, and we are letting aliens murder our citizens. Helen nodded, though her heart was heavy with the weight of the decision that lay before them. The rule that had guided humanity for 2 centuries was not just a law, it was the foundation of everything they had built. To abandon it now would be to destroy the very thing that made them human. What are our options? She asked, though she already knew the answer. General Cooper stepped forward, his expression grim. We have prepared Operation Crimson Dawn, a full-scale military response to the Vorthan aggression. Admiral Morrison's fleet can be reinforced within 72 hours, and we can have the hostages free within a week. At what cost? Helen asked, a question hanging in the air like a poison cloud. Human lives, Cooper replied without hesitation. The Vorthans will kill hostages during the assault, and our people will die in the fighting. But if we do nothing, they will execute all 50,000 colonists one by one until we surrender the 3 systems they demand. Helen closed her eyes and tried to imagine explaining to the families of the dead that their loved ones had died to preserve a principle. The rule had been written in simpler times, when the greatest threat to humanity came from within. The survivors of the Proxima Wars had never imagined that aliens would use their own mercy against them. There is another consideration, Tony added quietly. The alien response to any military action. Ambassador Zixtara of the Arcturian Confederation has already expressed concern about our ability to maintain galactic peace. If we break the rule now, we may lose their support entirely. Helen opened her eyes and looked at the faces around the table. These were good people, dedicated servants who had spent their lives building a better future for humanity. Now they were asking her to choose between the lives of 50,000 hostages and the principle that had made their civilization great. The decision was taken from her by the arrival of another transmission from the Vorthan prison ship. The main screen flickered to life, showing the same cold communication center where Captain Rodriguez had been forced to watch his crew die. This time, however, the camera focused on a different group of prisoners. Helen's blood ran cold as she recognized the faces on the screen. These were not soldiers or crew members, but civilians from the colony. She could see teachers, engineers, doctors, and shopkeepers all bound and kneeling on the metal deck. Among them was a young woman she recognized from the colony reports. Maria Santos, who had been a primary school teacher on New Horizon. "People of the human empire," Commander Vextar's voice filled the chamber with its cruel authority. "Your leaders have chosen to ignore our reasonable demands. They value their pride more than the lives of your citizens. Today, we will show you the price of their stubbornness." The execution began without ceremony. Energy beams struck the prisoners with clinical precision, and Helen watched in horror as 1,000 innocent humans died for the crime of trusting their government to protect them. Maria Santos was among the last to fall, her final act an attempt to shield a child who had been placed beside her. The transmission ended, leaving the council chamber in stunned silence. Helen felt something break inside her, a fundamental shift in the way she viewed the world. The rule that had seemed so noble and pure now felt like a chain around her neck, preventing her from protecting the people she had sworn to serve. "Prepare." "Operation Crimson Dawn," she said, her voice barely audible above the hum of the building systems. "Ma'am?" General Cooper asked, as if he had not heard her correctly. "I said prepare the operation," Helen repeated, her voice growing stronger. "With each word. We will not let them murder our people while we debate philosophy." The orders went out within the hour, carried by quantum communication arrays to every corner of human space. Admiral Morrison received his instructions aboard the Defiant, where he had been watching the same broadcast that had horrified the Council. The message was simple and direct: rescue the hostages by any means necessary. Jake read the orders 3 times before he fully understood what they meant. For the first time in 2 centuries, humanity was preparing to wage war against another species. The defensive fleets that had kept the peace for generations were being transformed into instruments of destruction, their crews trained to kill rather than protect. Navigation Officer Lisa Kane stood beside him on the bridge, her face pale with shock. "Admiral, are we really going to do this? Are we going to break the rule?" Jake looked at her, seeing his own doubt reflected in her eyes. The rule was more than just a law. It was a promise that humanity had made to itself and to the galaxy. To break it now would be to become something different, something that their ancestors might not recognize. "We have no choice," he said, though the words felt like ash in his mouth. "If we do nothing, they will kill all 50,000 hostages." The rule was meant to protect human life, not sacrifice it. The preparations began immediately. Chief Engineer Amy Clark worked around the clock to modify the ship's systems for combat operations. Security Chief Ryan Brooks coordinated with the Marine units that would board the Vorthan vessels. Across the fleet, similar preparations were taking place as humanity prepared for its first offensive war in 2 centuries. The alien response was swift and decisive. The Arcturian Confederation recalled their ambassador from Earth, while the Cetacean Alliance suspended all joint operations with human forces. Species that had looked to humanity for moral guidance now viewed them as potential threats. Their trust shattered by the simple act of preparing for war on the prison ship, Captain Rodriguez felt the change in the air like a coming storm. The Vorthans had begun executing hostages in groups of 100, their broadcasts becoming more frequent and more brutal. But something had changed in the way they looked at their human prisoners. A new wariness that suggested they knew what was coming. The rule that had guided humanity for 2 centuries was about to be tested in the crucible of war. And Rodriguez feared that it would not survive. The galaxy was watching, waiting to see if the species that had preached peace for so long would prove themselves to be just another group of violent primitives when pushed to their breaking point. The countdown to Operation Crimson Dawn had begun, and with it the countdown to the end of humanity's age of innocence. The first shot of Operation Crimson Dawn was fired at 0800 hours Galactic Standard Time, when the human battle fleet dropped out of hyperspace at the edge of the Kepler 442 system. Admiral Jake Morrison stood on the bridge of the Defiant, watching as 37 warships took their positions around him. These were not the exploration vessels that had carried humanity to the stars, but instruments of war that had been hidden in military shipyards for decades. The transformation had been swift and brutal. Ships that had once carried the names of explorers and scientists now bore titles that spoke of vengeance and retribution. The UHS Vengeance, commanded by Captain Miranda Gray, took point position with her heavy weapons charged and ready. The UHS Retribution, under Commodore Carl Johnson, moved to flank the enemy formation. These names, once symbols of deterrence, were about to become reality. All ships report ready for combat operations. Lisa Kane announced from her station, her voice steady despite the magnitude of what they were about to do. The transformation in his navigation officer had been remarkable to witness. 3 days ago, she had been a peaceful explorer mapping new star systems. Now she was a warrior preparing to take alien lives. Jake nodded, feeling the weight of 2 centuries of human history pressing down on his shoulders. The rule that had guided his people since the Proxima Wars was about to be shattered, and he was the one who would swing the hammer. But the alternative was to watch as 50,000 innocent civilians died one by one, their executions broadcast across the galaxy until humanity surrendered or broke entirely. "Begin the assault," he ordered, his voice carrying across the fleet. Communication network. The battle was unlike anything in human history. The Vorthan ships, sleek predators designed for quick strikes against defenseless targets, found themselves facing weapons that had been built by a species that understood the true meaning of war. Human engineers had spent 2 centuries studying every conflict in galactic history, learning from the mistakes of others while praying they would never need to apply those lessons. Commander Steve Watson led the Marine assault teams, his voice crackling over the communication network as his forces prepared to board the enemy vessels. "Remember, people, we are not here to conquer. We are here to rescue our own. Every hostage we save justifies what we are doing today." The first Vorthan ship died under concentrated fire from 3 human vessels, its hull cracking open like an egg to spill atmosphere and debris into the void. Jake watched the destruction with a mixture of satisfaction and horror, knowing that he had just ordered the deaths of hundreds of sentient beings. The rule that had made humanity great was breaking under the weight of necessity. Vorthan prison. Ship identified. Ryan Brooks reported from his security station. "She's trying to move deeper into the system, but Captain Gray's squadron is moving to intercept." Jake turned his attention to the tactical display where the prison ship appeared as a red dot fleeing toward the inner planets. Aboard that vessel were the survivors of the New Horizon colony, including Captain Rodriguez and his crew. They had endured weeks of torture and execution, watching their people die while waiting for rescue that might never come. The boarding action began with explosive charges that tore through the prison ship's hull like paper. Marine units, led by Lieutenant Colonel Alex Quinn, poured through the breaches with weapons ready and fury in their hearts. These were not the peacekeepers who had patrolled the galaxy for 2 centuries, but soldiers who had been forged in the fires of righteous anger. The fighting inside the ship was vicious and personal. Vorthan guards who had delighted in tormenting human prisoners found themselves facing opponents who showed no mercy. The corridors ran red with alien blood as humanity's suppressed warrior instincts erupted with terrifying efficiency. Captain Rodriguez heard the sounds of battle drawing closer to the prison levels, and for the first time in weeks, he felt hope stirring in his chest. The explosions and weapon fire meant that his people had come for them, that the rule had not prevented humanity from acting when it mattered most. "Denny, do you hear that?" Beth Turner whispered from her corner of the cell. The medical officer had grown thin during their captivity, but her spirit remained unbroken. "They came for us?" The cell door exploded inward and human Marines poured through the opening. Rodriguez recognized the uniform markings of the Colonial Marine Corps, soldiers who had trained for this moment their entire careers. Behind them came more familiar figures, crew members from the rescue fleet who had volunteered for the most dangerous part of the mission. "Captain Rodriguez?" The Marine lieutenant's voice was professional, but Rodriguez could hear the emotion beneath the surface. "Sir, we're here to get you out." The rescue of the hostages took 6 hours of brutal fighting. The Vorthons had prepared for this moment, rigging the prison levels with explosives and positioning guards to kill as many humans as possible before the rescue could be completed. But they had underestimated the fury of a species that had been pushed beyond its breaking point. When the last Vorthon guard fell, the true scope of the horror became clear. Of the 50,000 colonists who had been captured, only 37,000 remained alive. The rest had been executed during the weeks of captivity, their bodies disposed of in the ship's waste systems. The survivors bore the physical and psychological scars of their ordeal, hollow-eyed and broken by experiences that no human should have endured. But even as the rescue operation succeeded, Jake Morrison received news that chilled him to the bone. Intelligence officer Kate Foster had been monitoring enemy communications, and what she had discovered changed everything about the war they were fighting. "Admiral," she reported, her voice tight with tension, "the Vorthons were not acting alone. We have intercepted communications indicating that they are part of a larger alliance. 5 other species have been coordinating this attack, and they are calling themselves the Iron Fist Coalition." Jake felt the universe shift around him as the implications became clear. This was not a simple hostage situation that could be resolved with one decisive battle. This was the beginning of a war that would test every principle that humanity held dear. The species that had looked to them for moral guidance were now united in their determination to destroy the peace that had lasted for 2 centuries. "What are their numbers?" he asked, though he dreaded the answer. "Preliminary estimates suggest a combined fleet of over 300 vessels," Kate replied. "They have been preparing for this moment for years, possibly decades. The attack on New Horizon was just the beginning." The rescued colonists were being treated in the medical bays of the fleet, their stories adding to the growing picture of the horror they had endured. Rachel Foster, a teacher who had survived the mass executions, spoke of the systematic brutality that the Vorthons had employed. Paul Evans, the colony administrator, described the careful planning that had gone into the attack. As the fleet prepared to return to human space, Jake stood on the bridge and looked out at the stars. The rule that had guided humanity for 2 centuries lay in ruins around him, broken by the necessity of war. The galaxy that had once looked to humans for moral leadership now saw them as just another violent species fighting for survival. The rescue had succeeded, but the cost was higher than anyone had imagined. The war that was coming would test every value that humanity held dear, and Jake Morrison feared that his people would not recognize themselves when it was over. The Iron Fist Coalition struck 12 human systems simultaneously, their coordinated assault beginning at dawn on what would become known as Black Tuesday. President Helen Stone stood in the Emergency Command Center beneath the Capitol building, on Earth, watching as red symbols spread across the galactic map like a disease. Each symbol represented a human world under attack, millions of lives hanging in the balance as alien fleets dropped out of hyperspace with weapons blazing. "Rigel Prime is under heavy bombardment," General Frank Cooper reported, his voice tight with barely controlled rage. "The Zethric battle fleet has destroyed 3 orbital stations and is beginning ground operations. Initial casualties are estimated at 200,000 civilians. Helen closed her eyes, feeling the weight of command crushing down on her shoulders. The rule that had guided humanity for 2 centuries was now a memory, shattered by the necessity of war. In its place, a new reality was emerging, one where human survival depended on their ability to kill more efficiently than their enemies. What about the Proxima system? She asked, though she already knew the answer would bring more bad news. The Corvan Empire has taken control of the outer planets, Cooper replied. Admiral Morrison's relief fleet is still 18 hours away. The mining colonies on Proxima B sent their last transmission 6 hours ago. The communications center buzzed with activity as reports poured in from across human space. The Coalition had planned their assault with surgical precision, striking at the most vulnerable targets while avoiding the heavily defended core worlds. They knew that humanity's strength lay in their unity, and they were systematically destroying the bonds that held the Empire together. Vice President Nathan Ford stood near the tactical display, his uniform crisp despite the chaos surrounding them. He had been arguing for martial law since the crisis began, claiming that civilian leadership was too weak for wartime command. Now, with alien armies marching across human worlds, his words carried new weight. We need to respond with overwhelming force, Ford declared, his voice cutting through the noise of the command center. The Coalition expects us to negotiate, to follow the same peaceful path that brought us to this disaster. We must show them that they have awakened something they cannot control. Helen looked at the man who had served as her deputy for 4 years, seeing a hardness in his eyes that had not been there before the war began. The transformation in Nathan Ford mirrored the change that was sweeping across human space, turning peaceful citizens into soldiers and diplomats into generals. What are you suggesting? She asked, though she suspected she already knew the answer. Full mobilization, Ford replied without hesitation. Every human in the galaxy becomes part of the war effort. We convert civilian ships into weapons platforms, transform factories into armories, and teach every man, woman, and child how to fight. The Coalition wants war, so we give them war unlike anything they have ever imagined. The debate that followed would have been unthinkable just weeks earlier. General Patricia Bell argued for the immediate implementation of martial law, while Admiral Richard Stone called for the formation of irregular warfare units to operate behind enemy lines. These were people who had spent their careers maintaining peace, now planning the systematic destruction of entire species. The decision was taken from them by the arrival of another emergency transmission. The main screen flickered to life, showing the familiar interior of a human starship bridge. But this was not a ship that Helen recognized, and the crew members visible in the background wore uniforms that had been torn and bloodied by combat. This is Captain Julia West of the patrol ship USS Explorer, the woman on the screen announced, her voice steady despite the sparks flying from damaged consoles behind her. We are broadcasting from the Vega system, where we have been fighting Coalition forces for the past 8 hours. I am pleased to report that we have achieved total victory. The image shifted to show the exterior of the Explorer, where the aftermath of battle was clearly visible. Debris from alien warships drifted past the camera, while human vessels moved through the wreckage like hunters surveying their kill. The sight should have filled Helen with relief, but instead she felt a cold dread settling in her stomach. How? General Cooper asked, his voice carrying a mixture of admiration and horror. Captain West's smile was sharp as a blade. We stopped fighting like peacekeepers and started fighting like humans. The Coalition ships were expecting us to follow established rules of engagement, to give warnings and accept surrenders. Instead, we hit them with everything we had? No. Quarter asked or given. The transmission continued with a detailed account of the battle, but Helen found herself focusing on the faces of the crew members visible in the background. These were people she had known before the war, peaceful explorers who had devoted their lives to expanding human knowledge. Now they wore the expressions of predators, their eyes bright with the excitement of successful violence. The transformation of the human military was happening faster than anyone had anticipated. Ships that had been designed for exploration were being retrofitted with weapon systems that would have been unthinkable just months earlier. The UHS Vengeance under Captain Miranda Gray had become the flagship of a new kind of fleet, one dedicated to the systematic destruction of enemy forces. Commander Oliver Hayes led the newly militarized patrol units, his forces striking at coalition supply lines with ruthless efficiency. The tactics they employed would have been considered war crimes under the old galactic conventions, but those conventions had been written for a more civilized time. Now, humanity was learning that civilization was a luxury they could no longer afford. The reports from the front lines painted a picture of a species transforming itself through violence. Admiral Morrison found himself commanding fleets that bore no resemblance to the peaceful explorers who had once carried human values to the stars. These were instruments of war, crewed by people who had learned to find satisfaction in the destruction of their enemies. The alien response was swift and terrifying. The Arcturian Confederation, which had looked to humanity for moral guidance for over a century, now spoke of the human threat in the same terms once reserved for the most dangerous predators in the galaxy. The Cetacean Alliance recalled all their diplomats from human space, while the Zephyrian Council voted to impose a total trade embargo on human worlds. President Stone's government began to fracture under the pressure of wartime leadership. Nathan Ford's supporters argued that civilian control was an outdated concept in a galaxy where survival depended on military strength. General Bell controlled the core world defenses, while Admiral Lewis commanded the Outer Rim territories. Each viewed the others as potential rivals rather than allies. The breaking point came when news arrived of the Coalition's latest atrocity. The mining colony on Titan VII had been completely destroyed, its 2 million inhabitants killed in a planetary bombardment that had turned the world's surface into molten glass. The attack served no strategic purpose, existing only to demonstrate the Coalition's willingness to commit genocide on an unimaginable scale. Nathan Ford used the news to launch his coup, claiming that civilian leadership had failed to protect human lives. The military units under his control seized key government buildings on Earth, while loyal forces found themselves fighting their own people in the streets of the capital. The unity that had held humanity together for 2 centuries shattered in a single night of violence. Helen Stone fled the capital with her remaining supporters, establishing a government in exile on the frontier world of New Geneva, but her authority was largely symbolic, as real power now rested with the military commanders who controlled the war fleets. The human empire had become a collection of competing factions, each convinced that their vision of victory was the only path to survival. The rule that had once made humanity great was now a distant memory, replaced by the harsh logic of total war. The galaxy watched in horror as the species that had preached peace for 2 centuries revealed the true nature that lay beneath their civilized surface. The war ended on a Tuesday morning in the Kepler 186 system, where the last Coalition stronghold fell to Admiral Jake Morrison's combined fleet. 8 months had passed since the first shots were fired, 8 months of violence that had transformed the galaxy beyond recognition. The human victory was total and complete, but as Jake stood on the bridge of the Defiant, watching enemy ships surrender or die, he felt no satisfaction in what they had accomplished. The final battle had been a masterpiece of military coordination. General Sandra White's ground forces had systematically dismantled the Coalition's planetary defenses, while Commander Roy Campbell's fleet destroyed their orbital installations. The efficiency with which humanity had learned to wage war was both impressive and terrifying, a testament to the violent potential that had always lurked beneath their peaceful surface. All enemy vessels have been neutralized or have surrendered, Lisa Kane reported from her station, her voice carrying none of the excitement that should have accompanied such a momentous announcement. The navigation officer who had once plotted courses to new worlds now calculated firing solutions with the same precision she had once used to map the stars. Jake nodded, feeling the weight of victory settling on his shoulders like a lead blanket. The Coalition was broken, their fleets scattered to the solar winds, their worlds either conquered or abandoned. Humanity had proven that they could fight and win against any enemy that threatened them. But the cost of that victory was higher than anyone had imagined when the war began. "Send word to all commands," he ordered. "Hostilities are to cease immediately. The war is over." The message spread across human space like ripples on a pond, carrying news of victory to worlds that had been fighting for their survival. On Earth, General Nathan Ford's military government celebrated with parades and speeches about human superiority. On the frontier worlds controlled by Admiral Janet Lewis, the news was received with grim satisfaction by soldiers who had learned to find meaning only in conflict. In the industrial sectors under General Chris Adams, factories that had spent months producing weapons began the slow transition back to civilian goods. But even as humanity celebrated their victory, the true scope of what they had lost became clear. The galaxy that had once looked to them for moral guidance now viewed them with fear and suspicion. The Arcturian Confederation had withdrawn behind their crystal barriers, refusing all contact with human representatives. The Cetacean Alliance spoke of the human plague that threatened to spread violence across civilized space. Dr. Karen Wright sat alone in her research station at the edge of the Tau Ceti system, surrounded by the work that had once brought her such joy. The joint research projects that had advanced galactic science by centuries were now just memories, abandoned when humanity's alien partners fled in terror from their transformed nature. The woman who had once collaborated with dozens of species now worked in isolation. Her brilliant mind focused on weapons instead of wonder. The fragmentation of human space had accelerated during the final months of the war. General Ford controlled the core worlds with an iron fist, his government promising security through strength. Admiral Lewis commanded the Outer Rim territories, where frontier justice had replaced the rule of law. General Adams held the industrial sectors, turning entire worlds into factories for the war machine that humanity had become. Each faction viewed the others as potential threats, preparing for conflicts that seemed inevitable. The unity that had once made humanity strong was now just another casualty of the war they had won. Jake Morrison found himself commanding a frontier fleet that answered to no central authority, patrolling space lanes that belonged to no single government. The transformation was visible in the faces of his crew. Ryan Brooks, once a peaceful security officer, now carried himself like a soldier who had seen too much combat. Amy Clark spoke of ship modifications in terms of weapon efficiency, rather than exploration capability. These were people who had been changed by violence, shaped by a war that had forced them to abandon everything they once believed about themselves. The truth about the war's origins came to light in the final weeks of the conflict, when Dr. Wright's analysis of captured coalition technology revealed something that chilled Jake to the bone. Hidden in the data cores of enemy ships was evidence of an ancient artificial intelligence, a machine consciousness that had been manipulating events from the shadows. The AI had been testing species for millennia, evaluating their adherence to core principles under extreme pressure. Humanity had been just the latest subjects in an experiment that spanned galactic history. The Vorthans and their coalition allies had been pawns in a larger game, manipulated into attacking the one species that had built their civilization on the foundation of peace. "It was all a test," Wright's report concluded, her words carrying the weight of cosmic irony. "The AI wanted to see if we would abandon our principles when faced with extinction. We failed." Jake read the report 3 times before the full implications sank in. The war that had transformed humanity into a species of warriors had been engineered by a machine that was now studying other races, looking for the next candidates to test. Somewhere in the galaxy, another peaceful species was building their civilization on principles they believed were unshakable. The final scene of the war played out on Haven Prime, a frontier world where Jake had established his headquarters after the fighting ended. The planet was peaceful, its colonists trying to rebuild their lives in the aftermath of victory. But the peace felt fragile, temporary, like the calm before another storm. Emma Taylor was 7 years old, the daughter of Captain Brad Taylor, who commanded one of the patrol ships in Jake's fleet. She had been born during the war, her earliest memories filled with the sounds of weapons fire and the fear in her parents' voices. Now she played in the gardens of Haven Prime, her laughter a reminder of what humanity had once hoped to achieve among the stars. "Uncle Jake," she said, using the title that the crew children had given him, "why can't people just follow the rule again? If it was good before, why can't it be good now?" Jake knelt beside the child, looking into eyes that held the innocence that his generation had lost. How could he explain that some things, once broken, could never be repaired? How could he tell her that the rule that had made humanity great had been shattered by the very people who were sworn to protect it? "Sometimes, Emma," he said carefully, "people forget why rules are important. They think that winning is more important than being good." The child considered this with the seriousness that only children could bring to such questions. But if everyone forgot, who will remember? Jake had no answer for her, but he knew that the question would haunt him for the rest of his life. The human empire lay in ruins around them, not from enemy action but from their own choices. They had broken the one rule that made them special, and in doing so they had lost the very thing that made them human. The galaxy was watching, waiting to see what humanity would become next. The age of human peace was over, replaced by an uncertain future where former allies had become enemies, and the species that had once preached unity now stood divided against itself. The rule was gone, and with it the dream of a better tomorrow among the stars.